Hi guys, and welcome to this episode of the Happy Knitting Podcast. My name is Julia and I'm coming to you from Germany. Today is Thursday, the 15th of June 2017, which is a public holiday here in Bavaria, which is in the south of Germany, so that's really nice. I've spent pretty much the entire day knitting, and I met up with a friend, and yeah, it's been a very relaxing day, so that's great. So this is not going to be a regular episode. I just for a while have been wanting to do a more sort of rambly special episode because lately my episodes have been quite short. And so, like I said, this is not going to be a regular episode. Today I just wanted to kind of share my knitting story. So I've kind of mentioned it earlier in parts, how I started knitting, what my journey has been, but I feel like I've never really talked about it. And so I'm just going to do that today. I have a couple of samples with me that I'd like to show you and just talk about my venture into knitting. And of course, I would really like to hear your knitting stories. So I'm going to open a thread in the Ravelry group where you guys can share your stories, and maybe we can just discuss everything. And I think that would be really interesting. So I'm not gonna really show any active works in progress except for the sock that I'm working on right now. If you're not interested in this sort of thing, if you don't like rambly episodes, this is definitely not the episode for you. I just kind of wanted to share what I have been making in a couple of years ago, actually, and just see where it goes. So if you want, just join along and get some knitting, and let's just talk about some yarn. So, my knitting really started when I was a child. So my mom used to knit, but I don't think I've ever seen her knit actively. She used to knit lots of like straw knit sweaters when she was in university, but I think after that she stopped. Apparently she knit me a baby sweater. I was the firstborn, but I don't have any memories of that, and I don't know if it exists anymore. But my grandma used to knit. My grandma, actually, she used to knit a lot, and she was very crafty. She would also sew, and she was the sort of person that would fix everything, and like everything related to crafts, she was the person to go to. And I remember distinctly as a child, she made these amazing sweaters for us, and I would be like, I want socks that are, I don't know, turquoise and pink stripes, and she would go and do exactly that, and was really nice. I actually remember, asking my grandma repeatedly for knitting things, and my mom used to be like, it takes time, you can't ask too much, but I think my grandma really liked it. So anyways, she taught on me how to knit and how to crochet when I was a child. I don't really know how old I was, but I do remember knitting back and forth and doing knit stitches and purl stitches. And already back then, I was really interested in sock knitting because she used to do socks on DPNs. And she'd always tell me it's really difficult to knit on DPNs because you have to knit in the round. And I remember her showing it to me once or twice, but I don't remember ever knitting any big projects. It's just kind of, I wanted to know how it works, and then I lost interest. So then a lot of years later, actually in 2013, I felt like everyone was suddenly crocheting beanies. Like those Maiboshi, I'm not sure if it's a German thing. We have this yarn here in Germany called Maiboshi, which is spelled Boshi, I believe, and everyone was making beanies out of that, or like hats. So I was like, that looks like fun. I always like crafty stuff, so I went online and looked for a tutorial and learned how to crochet a hat from the top down. And I did about 5 of these, and then I kind of grew bored, and I also crocheted a scarf while not really knowing what was going on, and it was really ugly, to be honest. I gifted this terrible scarf to my then boyfriend, and the poor guy, it was so ugly. I remember when we split, he purposely left his ugly scarf, and I think I eventually actually did throw it away. It was really hideous. But yeah, so pretty much in the time of the breakup, I remember that suddenly I had this idea of wanting to knit socks. I don't really know where it came from. I think I was bored with the crochet, and sock knitting just seemed like something that I would like to do. So I think I was in Thailand at the time that this occurred to me, so I was determined to, whenever I got back from Thailand, to go see my grandma and ask her to show me how to knit socks. And so I did. I remember sitting in her apartment, and she gave me this swatch that was sort of like a checkered pattern. So it was like knit 5, purl 5, and then after a while it switched. And she just gave me that. So she's like, just practice, do some knit stitches, do some purl stitches. And I was like, but can I just start the socks now? And she's like, just do a couple more rows so you know what you're doing. And I was just really, really interested in the socks. So eventually she gave me some sock yarn, she gave me some needles, and I think she didn't really know that much about needle sizes and stitches at that time as well, because she hadn't knit for a while. So I think she cast on for me and did like 14 stitches per needle on really tiny needles. And it turned out that it wasn't a whole lot of yarn left as well. It was some kind of commercial sock yarn, but I just remember that was red. So, and the way that she used to knit socks was you would basically do 2 by 2 ribbing down until you reach the heel. So I did that first sock, and I remember when I finished, I wasn't living at home anymore at that time. So I would call her and was like, so how do I start this heel? And she explained to me how to do a heel flap on the phone. And then I think to do the actual heel turn, we printed off some instructions together, and she showed me how to do a heel turn. And this is how I learned to knit socks, to be honest. It just was sort of like a trial and error. And I remember when it came to knitting a toe, I just kind of knew that at some point I had to decrease stitches. I didn't really know how to knit a toe. So I remember just randomly starting to decrease 2 stitches and then knitting for 8 rounds and then decreasing again. And it was very, very unscientific. But in the end, I turned out a pair of socks. I actually did 2 socks that were pretty much alike because I did write down what I was doing. And of course, they didn't fit me because they were way too small. The stitches were more like a child-sized socks. So I think I ended up giving them to my sister, and she actually wore them. So that's not bad for a first sock, is it? So that's how my sock knitting started. So after that, I just knit a ton of socks. I just knit vanilla socks. I learned pretty quickly that I didn't like doing the rib down the legs, so I just decided doing socks like this. So you from the top down, 20 rows of ribbing, and then some kind of stockinette sock with a heel flap and gusset heel. And I was living in Würzburg at the time, so I would just go to one of the yarn stores there and pick up sock yarn and knit a pair of socks. And whenever I finished, I would pick up another ball. So I didn't have a stash or anything. I just kind of knit socks as I went. And I feel like that really taught me a lot. So I think I did that for at least a year. I remember when I met my boyfriend, I was telling him that I was knitting socks, and he was like, that's so strange that you knit socks, but okay. So yeah, I had, I think, 2 or 3 different yarn stores in the city where I was living at the moment, or at that time. And yeah, I didn't really know anything about sock yarn. I knew that they had this whole other selection of yarns, but I was always confused with yardage and the materials. So I just stuck with Regia yarn, Opal yarn, and I would just, I don't know how I managed to just knit socks. I just wasn't really interested in anything else. And then at some point I did discover hats. So I figured out how to knit a hat, which is, again, not very difficult. I'm sure most of you have knit a hat before, and still with all of this, I never used any patterns. I knit the way that my grandma taught me, so I would just kind of try to measure a gauge and figure out how wide does a hat need to be, and then I would just knit it. So the whole idea and concept of patterns and different stitch patterns was very, 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 very unknown to me. And yeah, so I feel like that still influences my knitting today. Today I knit a lot of patterns, which I'll get more into later. But I learned to knit more in the sort of just construct your own thing way, and I feel like that did help me a lot. And it definitely helps when you're designing patterns as well, which I haven't done in a while, but yeah. So I would love to show you some of the things that I knit at that point, but honestly, I don't know where it all went. I know I knit a couple of hats for my friend because she really liked hand knit things, and now in retrospect I'm kind of embarrassed because I don't think the hats were very great. But I don't actually remember ever keeping any of the things that I knit. I just, before recording this episode, went to my sock drawer and tried to find the oldest sock that I had, and I don't know where the first couple of pairs went. I know I gifted a lot of them to my sisters as well, but I think this was already knit. well into my, I don't know, I was definitely knitting for at least maybe almost a year until I finished these. So these are out of Drops Fabel, and they're just basic sock yarn. And as you can see, I did a heel flap. I did a moss stitch heel flap for some reason. I think I was just experimenting at the time. Heel flap and gusset heel and just vanilla socks. So these are my oldest socks that I found in my sock drawer. I don't really know. Maybe I have some more somewhere, but with moving twice in that time, I just don't really know where stuff went. So yeah, so like I said, I was mostly knitting socks and every now and then sort of commissioning hats. And I did also do a loop scarf because a friend of mine, she was knitting sort of like the big, just super chunky loop scarves. So I tried that as well, and again, I had no idea about gauge. I was like, so how many stitches do I have to cast on? And I just kind of figured it out, and I actually twisted the stitches, so it ended up being a twisted stockinette stitch loop, which of course just rolled up, and it wasn't very great. But anyways, I learned from my mistakes. And then I do remember that in 2014, I did start my first garments. So I just randomly decided, well, now I want to knit a sweater. And for my first sweater, I didn't want to spend a ton of money, and I was obviously still a student at that time. So I decided to just order some 100% acrylic yarn and just go for it. I wish I could show it to you, but I did throw away the sweater last year, and I was looking for some leftover yarn, but I couldn't find any, to be honest. So it was this really, really terrible, ugly yarn. It was, I think, maybe like a sport weight. It was 100% acrylic, and it had sort of like a variegated green to purple look. It was really ugly. But I just decided to go for it, and again, I looked up a couple of sweater patterns on the internet to get the measurements. So I don't know the numbers, but it's sort of like, well, I'm going to knit a tube from the bottom up, and it needs, for my size, it needs to be about, I don't know, 55 centimeters, I believe, was what I used to do. And then I would, knit a swatch, figure out how many stitches I have to cast on, and then just knit up until I reached the sleeves. And I'm not even sure what I did, to be honest. I really just sort of pieced it together in my mind and just did whatever felt right. And surprisingly, it actually worked quite well. I only wore that sweater once because it was incredibly hot, and it was super uncomfortable. It actually fit quite well, but just the materials, I just didn't like them. And then last year when we had the moss, this was the first thing that I just threw away. I also knit a sweater out of this yarn. This is some yarn that my great-grandma actually used to knit a sweater and then apparently had leftovers, and I found this at my grandma's place. And again, I decided to knit a sweater. So for this one, my grandma helped me. She laid out a sweater, we laid out a sweater that fit me, and we traced the sweater onto newspaper. So I had the dimensions, and then again, I wanted to knit it in the round, so we just gauge swatch and cast on and knit it in the round, and I knit it up to the sleeves, and I don't even remember what happened. I think I just knit straight up as well, and she told me how to make sort of like a crew neck. And then when I asked her, how do I knit the sleeves, like how does that work, she was like, well, let me see. And she took my sweater and she returned it back to me like a week later with the sleeves. So that was pretty funny as well. That sweater still exists. Actually, I gave it to my sister because she is tinier than me and it just fits her really well. But that's actually a pretty okay sweater, thanks to my grandma, who I'm still not sure if she actually undid the entire sweater and secretly just re-knitted, so I wouldn't notice. I'm not quite sure. But yeah, so that was my first sort of proper sweater. And again, I'm sorry I don't have anything to show you for that, but yeah, I don't know what happened. So from that point on, I just kind of made up my own things. I had no idea about yarns. So for example, I knit a summer top. I discovered Drops, which is a huge firm that has quite affordable yarns. And I just ordered all of their yarn and just tried what worked. And I had no idea sort of like what materials I liked. So for example, this is a Drops Loves You number 5, which is a recycled cotton. I think it's about like a worsted weight, and I knit a summer top out of this. Of course, I'm sure you can guess that it was really, really terrible. Again, I wore it like once, but I tried different stitch patterns. I did like drop stitches and garter bumps and stockinette and moss stitch, and all of these things were just huge swatches to me. So that was quite interesting. I also ordered some Chinese cashmere. This was super cheap. I got it off Amazon, and it's ridiculously soft, ridiculously thin. And all the label, everything is in Chinese, so I have no idea. But I got like a huge amount of this for like 10 bucks, and just held it triple and knit some kind of weird top, which again only fit my sister because it was way too small for me. And my sister has since tried to crochet a skirt onto it. So again, not a huge success, but this is sort of the thing that I just experimented a lot. I knit a sweater again out of, I think this is like a linen and cotton. I really don't know where all of these things went, to be honest. I was really confused when I started looking for them just now. But all of my old sweaters are kind of gone. The ones that I do have to show you is, for example, I knit, this is a jacket that I knit. Again, this was completely without a pattern. I think I went to the Drops website and just looked at measurements for garments, and then figured out how to knit a cardigan. This is all from the bottom up again. So I just cast on with some moss stitch, and then did a stockinette body with a moss stitch collar. I figured out how to knit a buttonhole, and then, as you can see at the top, there's no like ribbing or anything. I just bound off, but it works. This actually is quite wearable. I picked up stitches for the sleeves. Again, you can see it's not very well done, but it works. I did decreases on my sleeves. I did a garter, a moss stitch panel here, and I actually used a really, in my opinion, not fitting button, but this works. This still fits. This is out of Drops Cotton Merino, and I'm actually quite proud of this. This is one of the very first wearable garments that I made. Similar to this, I got some Drops, I think it's brushed alpaca silk, or just brushed alpaca, which is sort of like a mohair sort of thing. Like, it's really thin and very, very halo-y. And again, I just knit a sweater top, bottom up. So I just essentially knit a tube, or a square with a crew neck, which you can see here. I just bound off one side more loosely than the other to create the collar. And again, I just picked up the sleeves and just knit a couple of sleeves. And again, this is maybe not the smartest yarn choice because it's very sort of fluffy, but it does fit, it does. So I feel like from these sort of things, I really learned a lot. I think only like a year or two ago, probably 2 years ago, I started actually knitting from patterns. One of the first patterns that I knit, which was more like a recipe as well, is this is sort of like a shrug where you just knit a big rectangle and seam it together, and then it creates, sorry, this is all crinkled up. Can you see what I did there? I think it was just like a huge rectangle, and then you seam it in a certain way, and then that gives you holes for your arms, so you can just kind of throw it on whenever you want. And you can see here, back then, whenever I finished a ball of yarn, I just knotted on the next one, which again, I wouldn't do today, but oh well. Again, this does work. I did attach some I-cord in order to be able to just close it, or just tie it closed. And yeah, I still quite like this. I never wear it for some reason, but it is actually quite good for like a night when it gets slightly chilly and you still want to sit outside. So this is again also out of Drops yarn. And yeah, I remember knitting this while watching Elementary, which is the American version of Sherlock, and I was knitting and knitting and knitting and knitting and knitting, and it felt like forever. And it's kind of fun looking back on this now, but yeah, I'm really happy that I did keep some of my old knits because, yeah, they're quite entertaining. Regarding my sock knitting, I did always keep on knitting socks. And I think about 2015, I started discovering yarns from podcasts. So I watched my first knitting podcasts. The first two that I watched was The Knitting Expat, who is Mina, and Little Bobbins, who is Danny. And I think at the same time, I discovered sort of indie dyed yarn. So I remember in our, I think it was when we traveled to Vietnam, I always decide these things on holidays apparently. I ordered my first indie dyed yarn, which again, I can't find the socks, but these were the oldest sort of indie dyed yarn socks that I found. These are a pair of Hermione's Everyday socks, and I love these. I wear these all the time. I'm not quite sure when I knit them, but I could probably find the details on my project page. But this is my first ever pair of Hermione's Everyday socks. And the yarn is Drachenwolle, who was one of the very first German indie dyers that I tried, and I really love these socks. I wear them all the time. You can see I put in a fish lips kiss heel, so this was a lot further advanced into my sock knitting career. But yeah, I really love them, and these are one of them my most worn pairs of socks that I have, and I still wear them all the time, and they held up super, super, super well. So yeah, I love these. These are very proud sock knitting moments for me. Sorry, I had to go and erase some stuff from my phone memory. And also suddenly it's become very, very dark outside. So I'm going to try to keep this, or wrap this up sort of quickly, but not too quickly. So I was talking about my socks, and around the same time that I was sort of discovering indie dyed yarns and stuff, I also discovered more fancy well, commercial yarns, for example. I remember going to a really nice yarn store in Nuremberg, which I still really like to this day. And they had sort of like fancy yarns that were in skeins instead of in balls, which is what you get in a lot of like sort of cheaper yarn stores here in Germany. And I bought I think 250-gram skeins of some sort of alpaca yarn and one skein of Stoppelwolle Karat, which was their, I think this was sort of like a heavy lace weight yarn that I used to knit my, what's it called? The first shawl by Helen Stewart. I can't remember. Anyways, and I spent like 40 euros on yarn, and I was just like, oh my gosh, I spent so much money on this yarn. I was carrying it around like a treasure because at the time that was really new to me. And beforehand, I didn't have this was when I started my stash, and around the same time I did start my podcast. I started my podcast in, I think, August of 2015. So it's almost 2 years now, and that has definitely influenced my knitting a lot. So I started knitting my first shawls, and before I had my podcast, I should say I did have a blog, so I used to blog in German. And in hindsight, I'm really embarrassed about the sort of crappy things that I made and the terrible photography that I had, but it was just the best that I could do at the time. And again, I think I learned so much from that. And then looking back on it now, I don't really know how this, I feel like everything changed quite a lot in terms of what I like to knit, kind of things or yarns I like. I've really undergone some sort of transformation, and I think for me it was really, really important. Like, I know that some knitters today, they start out with Ravelry and patterns, and the first pair of socks that I knit is out of an incredibly fancy yarn, whereas for me, I feel like I started with the basics and then just kind of built on that, which was really, really helpful for me. Like, for me, knitting from a pattern actually came really, really late in the game. I think I discovered the Ravelry also around the same time in 2015, and I was like, oh, there's patterns, so you can just knit a pattern and you don't have to calculate your measurements anymore. Like, especially for sweaters, this was such a, like, I knew that there were patterns before, but I just never thought about using that. I would combine different patterns to get measurements, but the idea of just doing what the pattern says was somehow very new to me. So that completely changed my style of knitting as well. I was like, okay, so I don't have to figure this out anymore. I can just figure out the pattern instead and then just do that. Even though I do tend to alter patterns quite a lot, so that's probably why. And so yeah, so my knitting kind of really, really changed, and the sort of thing where you buy yarn and then you look for a pattern and all that, I didn't used to do that in the beginning, so that was quite interesting for me. And now I realize that a lot of times I'm looking for a very specific pattern, and I spend a long time looking for something that resembles the idea of what I would like to knit. And while the truth is, I could probably just design it. Not necessarily in writing up a design, but I could figure it out technically and would be much faster and less frustrating than finding the pattern that exactly is what I have in my mind. So I actually thought about it, and I do actually want to try to design more again. Not necessarily again to publish, because I just don't know if I have the time, but for simple things. Like, I spend so much time thinking I want an asymmetric shawl with 3 colors and some kind of girdle stitch and also this. And it's really hard to find a pattern like that if you have this specific image, and it would be much easier to just make it up, and yeah, I should just do that. So another big step in my knitting and crafting history, I guess, is spinning. I started spinning on a spindle in the summer of 2015 as well. Apparently I started everything in that time, but I did have a lot of time then. And then I remember on Christmas, so Christmas 2015, in the beginning of 2016, I got my spinning wheel, which is a Bliss by the Wool Makers, and that again changed a lot for me because I learned to spin relatively quickly and I spun a lot. In the first year, I spun so much yarn, it was kind of incredible. Again, I had so much time back then compared to now, which plays a huge role in why you're not focusing. Thank you. So I discovered spinning, and I feel like, again, that taught me a lot about fibers and yarn and spinning techniques. And even now that I don't spin that much anymore, I have a much better idea of what it is to use a 2-ply versus a 4-ply and woolen spun versus worsted spun yarn. So I feel like that was a really important part of my fiber journey as well. And I have picked up my spinning again, and now I feel like I can just do it if I want to. I don't do it all the time, but I like having the option there. So I feel like spinning really just sort of completed my knitting in the way that now I can create the yarn that I want for a certain project, and I know a lot more about color management as well, because that is quite important when you're spinning with hand-dyed fiber, because all sorts of things can happen depending on how you spin it, how you apply it, how you divide your fiber. And so yeah, that's another part of my crafty journey. So I guess ever since starting the podcast in the last year or two, my knitting hasn't changed that much. I think I've definitely developed more of a different knitting style in terms of expanding my techniques. So first, I think the biggest thing for me was learning how to do brioche. I feel like that definitely expanded a lot of things for me. I also did my first color work, even though I am not a huge fan of color work. I just don't enjoy the process, and I know that if I did it more, I would probably be better at it and enjoy it more, but I just don't really feel like it at the moment. And one thing that everyone keeps talking about is the sort of, are you a product knitter or a process knitter? And I think for me that's always stayed the same. And you can see it in the amount of crappy stuff I knit in the beginning and didn't care about, and still don't really care. I've always been all about the process, especially in the beginning, or I think even the first 2 years of knitting. I just picked whatever sock yarn looked nice to me, but I didn't really care. I just really wanted to knit. I just wanted to have something in my hands when watching TV or Netflix or whatever, or when taking breaks between studying, and that was sort of the only thing that I cared about. And obviously now I spend a lot more time picking perfect yarns and colors and patterns, but still, for me, the main focus is still just having fun with yarn and my needles, to the point where sometimes I feel like I really enjoy knitting all the colors, but I don't really wear them, so there's a sort of gap between what I like knitting and what I would like to have in terms of knitted objects. But most of all, I just don't really care. I think I try to go sort of a middle way with, on one hand, knitting things that I can actually wear, because I do like having something that I can actually wear to work. I've been starting to wear my grey featherweight to work, which is sort of like the only knitted objects besides socks that I can wear to work, because we do have a dress code. And it feels really nice to have something like that. And also, for example, I knit my crazy outline shawl that some of you might remember. And, I really thought about, I have a navy blue coat, and sort of thought about what the outfit would look like, which is something I didn't used to do. So I think that sort of sums up my knitting journey, and I know that was kind of all over the place, but oh well, so was my knitting journey, to be honest. And I'm really happy where I am now with my knitting. I feel like I've been pretty constant for at least a year or two. My stash has been slowly growing, but I have no shame about that. I feel really, really good about it. I feel like now I have a really good idea of what I like in terms of yarns and fibers, and I'm much better at choosing patterns, and of course I've just gained a lot of experience in knitting itself. So I feel like, the better you get at something, the more you can improvise, and it just makes it even more fun. So yeah, I guess that's sort of where I am right now, and I'm very, very happy about that. But it's really funny because when you talk to other knitters, you realize how different their knitting story is. For, like I said before, I know people that start knitting. I think that's sort of like the more traditional way of starting to knit today is, you go on Ravelry and you immediately start knitting patterns. And I feel like I just took a bit of a different route, and I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it did definitely give me a lot of experience. So by having to figure stuff out all by myself, I think like I just fudged so much. I just worked stuff out in the most terrible way a lot. Like I just I learned how to seam by doing it terribly for 10 months and then realizing that there's an easier way to do it. Or I used to join my yarns by just knotting them together, and now I know that that's not a smart idea, but I just learned by doing and by making mistakes. And yeah, I think I'm pretty happy about that. Feel free to post a comment here or in the Ravelry group. I'd be more than happy to answer them. But if you don't, I would, like I said, really love to hear how your love with knitting started and why am I going out of focus? I just don't get it. Yeah, I'm just really interested in your guys' thoughts and ideas, and yeah, I'm just really interested in getting in touch with you guys about that. So with that, I think I'm going to close this slightly rambly all over episode. I hope that you did enjoy it. Like I said, it's not what I usually do. I just feel like I haven't had a good talk to you guys in a while because my last episodes have been very rushed and sort of just barely getting through the finished objects and works in progress and nothing else. So I hope that you enjoyed this. And if you did, please do subscribe and become a regular viewer of the podcast. Of course, I would love that. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I hope to see you over in the Ravelry group, which I should say is the Happy Knitting Podcast group on Ravelry. And until I see you again, which is most likely going to be on the weekend when I do a regular podcast episode, but no promises made right now. Until I see you again, happy knitting, have a good week, have a nice weekend, and I'll see you soon. Bye!